April 1945. The war was nearing its end, but the air in southern Germany was still thick with the acrid smoke of collapse. In the bombed-out remains of a field hospital near Würzburg, nurse Marta Keller moved through the rubble like a ghost. The wounded were gone, evacuated, abandoned, or dead, and now her orders were clear: destroy all medical records before the Americans arrived. She crouched beside a makeshift fire pit, feeding in pages one by one. The flames consumed names, dosages, procedures, and secrets no one was meant to preserve. Marta's hands trembled as she dropped the documents into the fire. Some listed experimental treatments that had failed. Others contained requisitions for morphine that never reached the front. There were signatures of SS doctors she had learned to fear, their cold detachment leaking through every form. With each curl of ash, Marta felt a chapter of her life disintegrate. She was not innocent, she knew that, but perhaps in the confusion she could fade into anonymity. From beyond the shattered window came a low rumble, metal treads grinding over cobblestones. American tanks. Marta froze. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind. American soldiers, brutal and laughing, dragging German women into alleys. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood up, slowly, wiping her ash-stained fingers on the skirt of her nurse's uniform, and turned toward the entrance. Instead of a rifle barrel, it was a young soldier who appeared. He looked barely older than her youngest patient. His skin was darker than any German she'd ever seen, and he moved, carefully, cautiously, as if approaching something wounded. He held out a metal canteen, speaking one word in halting German: Wasser. When Marta didn't respond, he placed it on the ground and stepped back, hands raised. Suspicion flooded her mind. Surely this was a trick, some psychological tactic before interrogation. She stared at the canteen as if it might explode, but the thirst in her throat was unbearable. Days of stale air, of rationed water, of sleepless nights under the threat of air raids had taken their toll. Her fingers twitched. The fire beside her crackled, oblivious to the drama playing out at its edge. The American soldier didn't move. Instead, he knelt beside a wounded German soldier Marta hadn't even noticed in the shadowed corner. The medic opened a pouch, disinfected a wound, and began applying fresh bandages. His movements were practiced and calm, no hesitation, no cruelty. Marta watched in silence, unable to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught. When the soldier glanced back at her, his gaze wasn't full of judgment or hatred. It was simply tired. He gestured to the canteen again. Marta stepped forward slowly and picked it up. The metal was warm from the sun. She brought it to her lips. The water was clean, cool, and real. Her hand shook as she drank. As the sun dipped lower over the ruined town, Marta sat down on the cold stone floor, the canteen resting in her lap. She didn't say a word, and neither did the soldier. In that silence, something subtle shifted inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the foundation of everything she thought she understood. The transport arrived the following morning. An open-bed truck with wooden benches and 2 armed guards who barely spoke. Marta and the other captured women climbed in wordlessly, their movements stiff with exhaustion and fear. Most of them were nurses, typists, or communications staff, their uniforms now threadbare and smudged with ash and blood. No one knew where they were being taken. Rumors whispered through the group like smoke: Siberia, forced labor, starvation. Each woman held her silence like a shield. During the bumpy ride, Marta sat next to Gisela, a pale telephone operator from Cologne with hollow cheeks and nervous fingers. Gisela murmured stories she'd heard, of Russian camps where prisoners were fed well for a week and then worked until their bodies gave out in frozen mines. She spoke as if the same fate awaited them, only in American hands. Marta wanted to believe it would be different, but the fear had a taste now, metallic, bitter, and familiar. The wind bit at their skin as the truck moved farther from everything they had known. Several hours later, the landscape flattened into endless stretches of prairie. Camp Clinton emerged like a mirage on the horizon. Rows of wooden barracks, fences without barbed wire, and guard towers that seemed strangely unthreatening. The guards at the gate didn't shout. Instead, they called instructions in heavily accented German, asking for names, ranks, and units. It was surreal, like stepping into a scene from someone else's war, a place built for order rather than punishment. Marta was assigned to a clean, plain barrack with a dozen other women. The room smelled of fresh wood and soap, not urine or mold. Thin mattresses lined the bunk beds, and each bed had a blanket, a pillow, and a small folded towel. Through the window, she saw a group of American soldiers playing baseball in the distance, their laughter carried on the breeze. It was absurd, a game, here, while Europe collapsed just an ocean away. The sound made her stomach twist. At dawn, the first meal came. A freckled American private, no older than 18, brought in a tray and set it gently on the table. Marta blinked at it as if seeing an alien artifact. Scrambled eggs, still warm. 2 strips of bacon, browned at the edges. A slice of French bread that smelled like something from a time before the war. The boy smiled nervously, pointed to the food, and said in broken German, "Is not poison." Then he mimed eating and walked away. The room fell into silence as the women stared at their trays. Gisela leaned over and whispered, "They're fattening us, just like my grandmother used to do with geese before Christmas." A few chuckled under their breath, but no one moved. Hunger, however, was stronger than paranoia. Marta picked up her fork and took a small bite. The eggs were soft, seasoned, and impossibly rich. She hadn't tasted real seasoning in years. As the meal continued, Marta felt both gratitude and confusion battling inside her. This couldn't be real. Were they being tricked? Conditioned for some future cruelty? Yet her body didn't care. It accepted the nourishment greedily. Her stomach cramped from the sudden richness, but she kept eating, bite after bite, afraid it might vanish if she paused too long. That night, as the women lay in their bunks, Marta stared at the wooden ceiling above her. The sheets were real. The food had been real, and the guards had treated them like people, not enemies. But that only made things more terrifying. If everything she'd believed about Americans was wrong, what else had been a lie? In the quiet darkness, the fear of the unknown pressed down heavier than ever. Days began to blur together inside Camp Clinton. The routine was strict but not harsh. Roll call at sunrise, short walks around the perimeter, quiet meals served at long tables in the mess hall. Marta remained cautious, still expecting the sudden shift into brutality she'd heard so much about. But each day passed with the same surreal civility. No guards shouted, no punishments were given. The Americans acted more like caretakers than captors. One morning after breakfast, an officer came into the barracks holding a clipboard and called out Marta's name. She was escorted to the administration building, where a woman waited behind a desk. To Marta's surprise, the officer was not a man in a pressed uniform, but a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and weathered hands. She introduced herself in broken German as Major Andrews. Her tone was calm, professional. Marta braced for interrogation. But instead, Andrews explained that the camp medical unit was struggling. Many prisoners were sick, malnourished, infected, or suffering from what the Americans called combat fatigue. The American doctors had trouble treating them because the Germans didn't trust them, wouldn't speak, or refused help. They needed someone like Marta, someone who understood medical terms in both languages and could act as a bridge. Marta sat stiffly, unsure if this was a trick, but Andrews never pressed. Then Andrews offered something unexpected. She said Marta would receive extra food rations, access to books in German, and, if available, news about captured soldiers, possibly including Marta's brother. The mention of Hans hit her like a jolt. It had been months since she'd heard anything. The possibility of information, no matter how small, made her heart pound. Still, she hesitated. Trusting an enemy, even a kind one, felt dangerous. Martha accepted the offer with a nod, though her instincts screamed caution. That afternoon she reported to the medical station, where she met Dr. Keller. Not a German, but a tall American man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. He was treating a young German soldier, no older than 16, whose feet were swollen and cracked from months of poor footwear. The boy looked at Dr. Keller with wide, terrified eyes, expecting pain. Marta translated the doctor's words gently, explaining the disinfectant, the ointment, the bandaging process. The boy flinched at first, but as the care continued, something shifted in his face. He started to relax. When Dr. Keller wrapped the boy's feet and stepped away, the boy whispered, "Danke." It was barely audible, but it was there. Marta looked down at her own hands and felt the strange ache of something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. In the following days, Marta became a regular fixture in the infirmary. She helped with basic translation, explained treatments to confused prisoners, and even taught American medics a few key German phrases. The doctors never treated her like a traitor, nor did they ask her to do more than she was comfortable with. They simply appreciated her help. Slowly, Marta's wariness began to dull, replaced by quiet routine. One morning, after assisting in a small surgery to drain an abscess, Marta stepped outside into the crisp air. She watched two guards sharing cigarettes with German prisoners near the barracks. It wasn't camaraderie, not exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something else. Uneasy coexistence, perhaps, or reluctant understanding. Whatever it was, it didn't look like war. That night, lying in her bunk, Marta pulled out a torn scrap of paper and began to write. Not propaganda, not records, just her own thoughts. She wrote about the boy with the infected feet, the doctor who never raised his voice, and the strange, warm silence that settled over the camp like fog after rain. She didn't know if it was right, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel entirely wrong. The summer heat settled over Camp Clinton like a heavy blanket, pressing down on the barracks and the fields beyond them. Marta's days followed a rhythm now. Mornings in the infirmary, afternoons assisting with paperwork, evenings spent walking the perimeter path in silence. She was still a prisoner, technically, but nothing about this place matched her idea of captivity. There were rules, yes, but no cruelty. There was order, but also laughter. The war outside felt like a fading radio broadcast, still loud in the distance, but no longer dictating every breath. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, the guards announced an outdoor gathering for the German prisoners. Marta didn't understand what that meant until she stepped into the courtyard and saw long tables arranged under the shade of a canvas canopy. American soldiers and German prisoners sat side by side, sharing plates of grilled meat, bread, and something strange in small metal bowls, pink, cold, and melting fast. An American private handed her a bowl with a smile and said, "Try it, strawberry." Marta hesitated. Ice cream was something she'd only heard about in stories, a luxury reserved for childhood birthdays or summers that had long since evaporated under the heat of war. She dipped her spoon into the soft swirl and brought it to her mouth. The cold shocked her tongue. The taste was delicate, impossibly sweet. Ripe strawberries, cream, sugar, and something else. Memory. For a moment, she forgot where she was. For a moment, she wasn't a prisoner, or a nurse, or a German. She was just a woman eating ice cream in the sun. The absurdity of it struck her like thunder. How could something so joyful exist here? How could enemies share laughter over dessert while Europe smoldered in ruins? She looked around and saw a young American soldier showing a card trick to two Wehrmacht boys. Another group was passing around a harmonica, one side playing a German folk tune while the other tried to mimic it. The walls that had once defined everything, nation, ideology, vengeance, were dissolving under the weight of something simpler. That evening, in the infirmary, Marta received unexpected news. A Red Cross liaison had arrived with updated lists from the Eastern Front. Her brother's name was on it, Hans Keller, age 24, captured near Königsberg, currently held in a Soviet camp. He was alive. Marta stared at the paper, unable to breathe. Months of silence, grief, and hopeless wondering collapsed into one trembling moment of fragile relief. Alive. That word alone was worth more than rations, more than books, more than comfort. She spent that night sitting on the edge of her cot, writing a letter she knew might never reach him. She described the camp, the infirmary, the faces she saw each day. She described the ice cream. It made no sense, she wrote, but it tasted like peace. She didn't know whether he would believe her. She barely believed it herself. But she needed him to know that the world was not entirely lost. In the days that followed, Marta began to laugh more, to speak freely with the medics, and to help the younger prisoners who still carried fear like a second skin. She encouraged them to eat, to speak with the guards, to ask for help when they needed it. Some resisted, others followed. Small gestures, shared smiles, pieces of normalcy rebuilding themselves brick by brick. But beneath it all, she still carried the question she hadn't yet dared to ask aloud. If this kindness was real, if these Americans truly treated them like people, then what had been the point of the hate? What had they fought for, if not the protection of lies? And if everything she'd been told was false, about enemies, about mercy, about the world, then what did that make her? She didn't have the answers. But each morning when she stepped into the infirmary and tied on her apron, she carried the memory of that first spoonful of strawberry ice cream like a talisman. Proof that something sweet could still exist in the ruins. The morning air had turned cooler, and the prairie winds carried the scent of changing seasons. Marta noticed that the camp's atmosphere had changed too. The guards were still polite, but more distant. The American soldiers no longer lingered for small talk. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Rumors had begun to spread among the prisoners, rumors of resentment, of growing pressure from the outside world about how the enemy was being treated too well. One afternoon, while collecting supplies from the mess hall, Marta overheard two guards talking. Their voices were low but tense. One of them, a corporal with a southern drawl, muttered, "These people eat better than my brother did on Okinawa. Fresh bread, meat, even ice cream. It's disgusting." His tone was bitter, like acid. The other guard didn't reply, just shifted uncomfortably and lit a cigarette. Marta didn't react, but the words sank deep. That night, Marta pushed her dinner tray away. She couldn't bring herself to eat the warm stew or the soft bread. The taste had turned foreign. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from guilt. She thought of Hans, still a prisoner in the East, if he was even alive. What was he eating, if he had eaten at all? She imagined him starving in some cold Soviet camp, while she sat in the relative comfort of a clean American one, being served like a guest. It was Gisela who noticed first. "You're disappearing," she said quietly as they folded laundry together. "Like my aunt after the First War. She lost her son and stopped living, even though she kept breathing." Marta didn't answer. She was too tired to argue. too tired to explain the heaviness growing in her chest like a stone. The guilt had begun to feed on her, hollowing her from the inside out. The infirmary no longer felt safe. Martha started avoiding it, skipping translation duties, refusing to meet the eyes of the medics who asked where she'd been. Even Dr. Keller, with his quiet voice and steady hands, seemed like a stranger now. She knew they had not wronged her, but she couldn't reconcile the kindness they had shown with the weight of what she now believed, that it had all been conditional, temporary, a thin veil over the truth of war. It didn't help that others noticed her withdrawal, and into the silence stepped Kurt Brenner, a former SS officer who had kept his distance for months. Now he appeared at Marta's side during meals, during roll calls, during walks. He spoke calmly, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the world was returning to its natural state. "You see now," he said one day as she stared at a bowl of untouched porridge, "they played at mercy, but they still see us as the enemy. You were just a tool." Marta didn't reply, but the words stuck. Brenner knew how to wield guilt like a scalpel. "Your brother is probably dead," he continued another day, "while you smiled at their doctors and ate their food. What would he think of that?" The question lodged in Marta's mind like a splinter. It didn't matter whether Brenner was right. The damage was done. She stopped writing in her notebook. The pages that once held tentative hope now felt shameful. Each line a betrayal, each word a weight. She let her translations fall behind, stopped attending morning medical meetings, and withdrew from the other women, who whispered about her in hushed tones. Even Gisela, once a constant companion, had grown distant, unsure how to reach someone slipping further into herself each day. In the mirror above the communal sink, Marta saw a face she didn't recognize. Gaunt, gray-eyed, and silent. She wondered if this was what death looked like, not dramatic or sudden, but a slow erosion, a quiet surrender to doubt. The strawberry ice cream, once a miracle, now sat in her memory like a cruel joke. The taste of peace had curdled into the taste of betrayal, and Marta once again felt like a prisoner, not of war, but of her own mind. The frost came early that October, silvering the Iowa grass and etching delicate patterns onto the windows of the barracks. Marta woke to find repatriation papers on her bunk, her name neatly typed at the top, the destination listed simply as Germany. The word no longer felt like home. She stared at the forms with numb detachment, unable to imagine what she would return to. Her village had been flattened. Her apartment in Berlin had been reduced to brick dust. Her brother's fate still lingered in uncertain Soviet records. She had stopped going to the infirmary weeks ago. The doctors had stopped asking. The silence between her and the camp staff had grown heavy, punctuated only by mechanical exchanges and polite nods. Marta no longer wrote. The notebook that once held her reflections lay beneath her mattress, untouched, like a relic from another self. She moved through the days like a ghost, eating little, speaking less, waiting for her name to be called for departure. One evening, while sitting alone on a bench behind the medical station, she was startled by the familiar sound of approaching footsteps. It was Corporal Jimmy Torres, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. Without a word, he sat beside her and offered one. The warmth seeped into her palms, but she didn't drink. They sat in silence until he finally spoke. "You blame yourself," he said quietly, "for Hans, for being here while he was somewhere else." Martha didn't deny it. Her voice was flat when she answered. "He was starving, dying, and I was eating ice cream." Torres let the words hang in the air. "So was I," he replied eventually. "When my brother Miguel died in the Philippines, I was in Texas, in medical school, learning how to suture clean wounds while he marched barefoot for 60 miles. His voice was steady, but the grief beneath it pulsed like a second heartbeat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photo, two boys laughing on a sunny afternoon. "He wrote letters," Torres said. "He told me about the Filipino nurses who risked their lives to help Americans, about the Japanese medics who sometimes shared rice with prisoners. He said mercy is a choice, even when it hurts." Marta listened, her eyes fixed on the photo. The idea felt distant, almost impossible. "What did he choose?" she asked softly. "To see faces instead of uniforms," Jimmy answered. "To remember that most people are just scared and far from home, like we are." He looked at her with something that wasn't pity, but recognition. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of understanding, like the stillness after a storm when everything broken has been laid bare. After he left, Marta remained seated, the coffee cooling in her hands. She thought of Gisela, of Dr. Keller, of Major Andrews with her tired smile and quiet grief. She thought of the boy who had whispered "thank you" after she helped wrap his feet. Not enemies, not monsters, just people, suspended in the wreckage of war, trying to find something human to hold on to. The next morning, she returned to the infirmary. She didn't explain. She simply picked up a clipboard and began translating again. Dr. Keller handed her a chart without comment, and the rhythm resumed as if it had never broken. That afternoon, Jimmy found her in the mess hall and placed a small bowl in front of her. Strawberry ice cream. She stared at it for a long time before finally lifting the spoon. It tasted the same, sweet, cold, ridiculous. But this time, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like resistance, a refusal to let guilt win. A way to honor Hans, not by starving with him, but by surviving for him. She took another spoonful, then another, letting the flavor melt across her tongue like the memory of sunlight. When the truck arrived to carry her eastward, back across the ocean to whatever remained of Germany, she carried the notebook in her coat and the taste of forgiveness in her mouth. Not all the questions were answered, not all the wounds were healed, but she had made one choice, and sometimes, in the aftermath of war, that was the beginning of peace.